Okay. All right. So Brian Silvestry here, live on Facebook. Very special guest this week, Seth Kessler, commercial real estate broker with SCG Retail. He's a senior broker with SCG, and he joined that firm in 2015 to help expand the company's landlord representation. With more than 15 years of commercial real estate experience, specializing in both representing landlords, real estate developers, and also retailers. At his current firm, Mr. Kessler has leveraged his strong landlord relationships to immediately build his core business throughout Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens. Recently completed leasing transitions with some of the largest landlords in New York City, including Extel, George Comfort and Sons, F&T Group, RXR, Apple Bank, ABC Properties, and Fisher Associates. Prior to SCG Retail, Mr. Kessler spent nearly 10 years as vice president and senior broker at Cornerstone Group, a boutique commercial real estate firm in New York City. While over there, he specialized in representing both landlords and tenants for retail, office, and industrial leasing. He was responsible for leasing more than 300,000 square feet during his tenure. Previous to his time at Cornerstone, Mr. Kessler worked with a real estate developer in Tampa, Florida, that specialized in grocery store anchored shopping centers along the East Coast. So welcome to the Facebook Live, Seth. Great to
Thank-
have you here.
Thanks for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. So I think we probably got to know each other. You're with Cornerstone, so this was probably a good dozen years ago, right?
Absolutely. It's been crazy how time goes, but it's probably been close to like 10 or 12 years. It has definitely been a while.
Yeah, yeah. So, so I'd like to dive right in. I mean, one of the things that I've been talking about on the lives here is, the current residential real estate market and what we've been seeing. And I've had some guests here with me and just talking about that. And so, love to hear, like, you as a commercial real estate expert, like, what are you seeing in the areas that you focus in right now?
Yeah, sure. So, obviously over the past, I guess it's been almost 2 months or maybe even a little bit longer that we've all been in lockdown in quarantine. Um, from really the first week, we just heard most retailers say that they're just putting all expansion plans on hold until this pandemic, and quarantine life gets back to normal. So not much has changed in that front. Um, a lot of the conversation has shifted from we're putting things on hold to now they're trying to figure out how they're going to reopen, how these tenants, the restaurants, the hair salons, the spas, things like that, where there's more physical contact, of how they're just going to reopen. What are their reopen strategies going to be? So they've even gone more so from putting things on hold to we need to figure out how we're going to get back to life in the near future, whether that's the next 6 months, a year, or 2 years.
Mhm.
Um, so it's really has transitioned, but that has been the conversations, and that's actually coming from the tenant standpoint. The landlords have been talking all over the board. I've heard some landlords saying, "Look, the rent's due. We need our rent for the past 2 months," which I don't think that those landlords are going to, I don't agree with those landlords. Then a lot of my clients have been saying, "Look, we know where this is going. We need to work with our tenants, and yeah, the rent is due, but we need to figure out a way where they're going to stay in business so they can continue to fill our spaces. And, it's a partnership. So most of my landlords that, or my clients that I do repeat business with have been saying we need to figure out how to keep our tenants in business. And some of them have unfortunately already given the keys back and said, look, they can't fulfill their responsibilities. And some tenants that weren't making money or weren't making much money are taking this as a time to kind of trim the fat and say, look, we're dead in the water now and we aren't going to bounce back from this. So that's been some of the more recent conversations that I've been having on a daily basis with tenants and landlords.
And are you seeing, so basically the landlords are, would you say, for the most part they're for putting rent off and allowing the tenants some time? And how does that work in terms of what would be the plan for, like, let's say for a restaurant, if they don't pay the rent for a couple of months, do they have to, is it 2 months or is it 6 months? And how do they pay back those arrears? Like, how does that all wash out?
So a lot of, again, it's each tenant and each landlord handles each deal differently. But what
Mhm.
I've been seeing and hearing that a lot of tenants are going to do, they're deferring the rent for later in the lease. Some of them are saying, look, if it's 3 months, then every month for the length of the lease will be a little bit increased to make up those 3 months. Some landlords are saying we're going to defer payment all the way until the end of the lease. So if it's 3 months deferred now, they will extend their lease by 3 months. Um, the only catch with that is it will be at the then escalated rent. So the landlord gets a little bit more, at the end of the lease. The only thing is what, excuse me, what the landlord risks is if the tenant doesn't make it for that new part of the lease. But it's a risk that some landlords are willing to take, and some tenants are also willing to take that as well. Something that I have heard, which I haven't seen it much around in New York, but in some of the other markets, landlords are saying, "Look, we will extend if it's 3 months deferred. Right now we'll extend your lease by 6 months or another year to so there's a little bit more upside for the landlord for not making the money now, but they're gonna get a tenant for a little bit longer." So I have heard some landlords doing that in again other states and other markets, but mostly in New York, I've heard a lot of like 1 for 1 months, deferred now till the end of the lease, and it
Interesting.
helps the landlords out quite a, or I'm sorry, it helps the tenants out a lot because they don't have to worry about the payments now, and they will have to worry about them, in the future. But hopefully they'll have, cash flow and enough money that, they'll be able to afford to pay for those rents to stay in business.
Right, interesting. And so, uh, before all this happened, like, what were you seeing, in the retail market? Like, was it more in favor of, the potential tenants, and because we just as regular, people that just walk around, we see a lot of, even before the pandemic, a lot of empty storefronts, and you hear all this, anecdotes about oh, the landlords want too much money, and that's why the stores remain empty. And also, I think wasn't a little while ago that and we were talking about this the other day that De Blasio was going to fine landlords for keeping storefronts empty. So, can you talk a little bit about, like, even just give us some perspective before the pandemic? What type of market was it as far
Yeah,
as?
absolutely. So, over the past 3 years or so, the curve has really started to shift. The rents were at all-time highs, and now they started to come down. A lot of the asking rents were still pretty high,
Mhm.
um, but the deal prices were getting to be more reasonable. In that's in obviously there's been select markets like Times Square and Flatiron that prices have remained pretty high, but across the board on an average in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, the asking rents have remained high, but the deal prices have been, a lot lower and a lot more reasonable. Um, and there has been a lot more inventory. There have been a lot more listings available over the last couple of years. And like you said, the city was talking about putting a tax of a vacant store tax on. I think now that conversation is going to be completely gone. I don't think you're going to hear about that just because you know they're saying that there's going to be 10,000 restaurants that are going to go out of business, you know,
Wow.
after the pandemic, whether that's again 6 months or a year from now. But 10,000 new properties that are going to hit the market. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of new spaces, and that's just restaurant space. There's going to be a lot of dry retailers that aren't going to bounce back from this either. Whether they're saying we can do just as much business online, or they just can't afford to stay in business. Um, and there was one other question that you had. There was a couple parts to that question. Um,
Mhm. Sure. Just as far as, like, how the just the overall market conditions. and which I think that you covered. And I also it's interesting you mentioned about the restaurants because we see a lot, we hear. Even have some clients that are saying, oh, they're getting ready to go back to work at a restaurant, but it's only just for for takeout or delivery.
Right.
So how does a restaurant pay their monthly rent when they have nobody sitting down and eating?
Right.
So yeah.
So yeah, I mean that's going to be a big story, and that a lot of it, what you just said is like it's going to be everything is all linked. So the servers that were that was their job, and that's how they paid their rent and paid their bills, are out of a job. Um, so if they can't come back to be a server, if it's pickup only or delivery, that's just there's gonna be a huge trickle down effect, which they're not gonna be able to pay their rents. And then, are they gonna have to leave the city? Like there's gonna be a lot of, and then if they have to do that, there's gonna be a lot more apartments on the market and a lot more houses for sale. Um, so it's definitely gonna be a huge, domino effect. And then one to go back to part of your other question was um, pre pandemic, a lot of the expansion was a lot of mom and pops. They were coffee shops that had 2 or 3 locations. They were looking to do 4 or 5. A lot of restaurants doing the same thing. Now, the mom and pops are the ones that are unfortunately going to be going out of business because they just don't have the amount of locations to float all of them. So it is going to be really interesting when this is all over. What happens with the mom and pop restaurants and retailers? I say restaurants, but all retailers, because if they can't afford, if their livelihood was the one restaurant, and before they were looking to open up a second or third, now if they can have their first one, what are they going to do? Um, as everyone knows, New Yorkers are fighters, so it will be interesting because if someone owned one restaurant and that was their sole source of income, and they close it, they need to do something. So I think in time the rents are going to start to come down tremendously just because there's going to be so much inventory on the market, that I still think those same mom and pop restaurant owners and dry retailers are going to open up something. And I think it's just going to be, you're going to see a lot of leases that have pandemic clauses in it. You're going to see a lot of rents that are going to be a lot lower. You're going to see good guy guarantees probably be I don't think many people are going to start to sign good guy guarantees. Security deposits are probably going to be quite a bit lower because people just don't have that money. So it's going to be riskier for the landlord, but again, it's also going to be risky for the tenant because they're going to be investing money back into the space, and again, hopefully it's money that they have, and will be able to open up a successful business to make more money.
And also, there's a link with all of this stuff, and as you said, there's a trickle down. So about a year ago, they changed the rent laws, and they really are heavily in favor of the tenants now. So it makes certain things that landlords took advantage of in the past to make an upside, a profit on apartment buildings, that's gone. And so now, with the pandemic, now we have a lot of retail that's closed and going to be maybe not reopened, and so a moratorium on evictions. So and then so it gets harder for the landlords, and then it's also, I think, for a lot of people, neighborhoods are going to take a little while to recover. Right now we're all just mostly just focusing on just getting to the next day and surviving, and places are closed, and so we're not really focused on that. But in a few months, when things start to reopen and certain things don't reopen, or they reopen and there's just no way that they're going to be able to make ends meet with limited services that they could provide. So, like, going forward, like, what do you think we're going to see, in the retail market?
So you brought up neighborhoods, which is really interesting. So previously, a lot of tenants were looking for space. A lot of national tenants and even mom and pops, they would look for space in you know a highly office market and also big residential market. So they would have 7 day a week traffic. Um, so the interesting part is with, obviously the MTA is doing a lot right now to clean the subway and keep it germ free and everything like that. But I have a feeling a lot of, me personally, to ride the subway is going to be probably like probably the last thing that I'm going to do to get back to real life, to normal life, whatever that is. Um, but so I think neighborhoods are going to actually bounce back a little bit quicker because people aren't going to want to travel as far to go, to that restaurant or to that, hair salon or something like that. So I think that closer neighborhoods are going to be, you're going to find a lot more, services in the actual residential neighborhood as opposed to in the commercial market. Um, and we also talked about this the other day. Is Twitter made a huge announcement. I guess it was last week. Facebook has followed suit, and there's been a lot of the bigger companies that are starting to come out and say you got their employees can work from home, and if the employees work from home, again in the short term, leases are leases. So if they get out of their leases, I don't, that's a whole nother story. But if people get out of, if they don't renew their leases or they take much less space in the office market, that's just going to drive retailers to not want to open up in those office markets, and they will want to stick to where people are living. So I do think that smaller neighborhoods where they probably didn't see much retail are going to be bouncing back a little bit quicker than the Times Squares, than the Midtown West, and the Garment District. Because if the people aren't going to be in the office, as like they were, that's what supports those the retailers in those markets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you said, there's one. It's all linked together.
Mhm.
It's all linked together because the effect on just even before the pandemic, seeing more storefronts empty than normal, which probably just amounts to like one every block or one every 2 blocks or something like that. And then you see, the storefronts empty, so sometimes homeless people start hanging out there and panhandling and stuff. So it really changes the dynamic of way that things look. And I'm just wondering, like going forward, because you mentioned even some of the tech companies, and as we were talking the other day, some companies right now are really they are crushing it. Like you have the supermarkets and places like that, and obviously Amazon. And so, but is there, with all of that inventory that you're going to have, is there enough of a demand that might make a dent in some of that supply, or is it really just going to be like a drop in the bucket type of thing?
It's definitely going to take probably a couple years to ramp back up to seeing a visual amount of less storefronts available.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just because again, if there are restaurants that go out of business and they have one location, they're going out of business probably because they can't afford it. So maybe the business owner was able to save some money, you know, to reopen
Mm-hmm.
like a new location. But if they can't afford their current space and they want to open up a new location, they're going to have to invest a lot of money into the design, into the kitchen, you know, into marketing, all the costs of starting up a new business. So it is going to take time for this all to level out. Um, but again, I mean, we haven't in our era, we haven't seen anything like this. 2009, during the crash was a financial crisis. So rents started coming down and it took, 10 years to start to build back up. And, 5 years ago, 4 years ago, we were at, all-time high rents in the retail market and even office market. The office market, was really high. But now it's not a financial crisis. It's just like a well-being and health crisis. But because of that, it's causing a financial crisis. So it is just going to be super interesting to see how this bounces back. And especially with the restaurants, because those are, the first things to open right now. Um, so it's going to be interesting to see how that is going to play out. And again, maybe during the summer months, the city's talking about closing off the streets so people can, dine outdoors. Um, I know in, places in Florida, they're doing that. They're closing, big sections of their parking lot. But here it's going to be for the summer months, maybe a little bit into the fall, but and it's also how many seats and tables can you fit outside. So it is just going to be really interesting, and we're going to learn over the next probably 2 or 3 weeks how these companies really bounce back and see how they are.
And so in a restaurant, like what will they do? They'll have if they have 20 tables or something, they'll spread things out and maybe they'll get five or six or something like that.
Yeah, so right now they're, we've heard, they're going to be doing 25% capacity. I have heard up to like 33%. Um, but again, 33% capacity, you know, I don't know if they're making money at that point. Restaurants run on a very slim budget, or margins, I'm sorry. So, if they have to carry all the food costs, maybe they have a limited menu, so they don't, so all their food costs aren't there. But if it's a limited menu, maybe you're not going to want to go there if it's a limited menu. So there's a lot of things that are gonna happen. And also, people haven't been working. Some people have, but a lot of people haven't been working. So the people that haven't been working, can they even afford to go out to their favorite restaurant where before they would get drinks and dinner and they spend 100 to $200-300, whatever it is. You know, can they afford to do that on a regular basis to support these restaurants is another big factor, which I haven't really been hearing many people say, but people do want to get back to a some kind of new normal, and restaurants and coffee are kind of those you can go out and feel you're not making a huge they're affordable luxuries that people will want to start to get back to. So it's again, it's just going to be interesting, and I don't know, and a lot of brokers don't really know where it's going to head. But if you can get 25% seating inside, and you can get a few tables outside on the sidewalk cafe, and if the city does shut down part of the street to get a few more tables, it would definitely help because every table will and every customer will. But again, nothing's been set in stone. So over the next couple of weeks, I'm sure there will be, more information that comes out.
And and yeah, thank you. And then also, what does that do potentially to rents? And what would you advise landlords like going forward in terms of how are they going to deal with the fact that the restaurants or the businesses are at such a percentage of capacity, so they're putting off the couple months that the restaurant is closed or the business is closed now, maybe prorating it over the course of the whole lease or putting it at the ends of the lease. But the fact is that the restaurant's only going to be operating at 25%, and that's probably not enough money to be paying the full rent.
Right.
So what does that do with the rents, and what advice would you have for maybe for landlords in terms of how they're going to deal with that?
Yeah. So it's also, a really interesting, case study for that because yeah, if companies and restaurants are making, if they're 25% full and they're making 25, then you have carry out and delivery and things like that. So let's say they're at 30 or 40 or 50% of what they were, then they're going to say, look, we can't afford this. We need a rent reduction by that same percent. So you are definitely going to see a lot of percentage only deals in the foreseeable future. Again, maybe that's a year or two, maybe three, but probably a year or two. But then also landlords might not want to lock into a long-term deal because nobody knows what the future is going to hold. So, I think landlords if they own multiple buildings, maybe for their best locations, they will hold off on and then they'll fill up some of their other retail with lower rents just so they can get tenants in there and get obviously some income. And they might hold off until there's a more of a bounce back to lease up their more prime locations in their buildings or their more prime retail. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's going to be, if it does go percentage only, um, it's going to be very, really interesting times. But again, that might be the safest way for the tenants to reopen. And, again, if landlords are bullish that things are going to bounce back, they might take that. And, there's also, bigger upside if they do that. If a restaurant comes out and absolutely crushes it, they'll make more money than they would have. But it'll be super interesting, in the next 6 months to a year to really see where things settle.
And I think that that's a lot of what we're looking at to a similar degree in the residential side, where I get a lot of people that we're discussing a potential sale or doing something in now or in the next year or 2 years. And on the residential side, if they're definitely going to be selling, then I advise them to sell now, because I think that in a year, even in the most rosy scenario, most optimistic scenario, the market's going to be lower than it is now, and that's assuming no stock market crashes and assuming that the second wave is not a huge second wave and that things stay under control. So and then you also have to you have to factor in just the fact that there's do people want to live in the city? There was an article in the Times we were talking about the other day. Do people want to live in the city or in cities because it's close to work, or they just like living in the city? And so one of the things that the Times was noting, it was a trend that people were spending anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4 or even the whole week working remotely. So since they're working remotely, they figure, okay, well, why don't I live someplace that's less expensive? I have more space, have an easier life, And so if people are drawn to the city or cities because they just like living in the city, but does that mean that they will still also like living in the city, when a third of the block stores are not there,
Right.
where they're empty?
Right. Yeah. It's like, are people going to want to live in a city? People are drawn to a city for a multitude of reasons. For New York, it's, museums, Broadway, restaurants. You can do anything you want at any time you want. But if those aren't here because of the pandemic and people are out of business, is this place going to be a great place to live? It's, for a young family, I don't know if they can't, what do they do with their kids? If the indoor playgrounds are closed in January or December, what do you do with your kids? If they close the building playroom, what do you do with your kids? If you're in the suburbs, you have a lot more square footage that you can designate to, kids to run around. I mean, as it's really tough with,
Mhm.
young kids during this. And a lot of people have gone, rented houses in the suburbs where they, for a month or two or whatever it is. I know, rental prices, in the suburbs and in the Hamptons right now are through the roof because everyone just wants to get out of the city to enjoy, you know, a little bit more space than what they would. But I mean, it is really going to be interesting. And again, like we were talking about before, with with servers in restaurants and real estate brokers that haven't been working and aren't working. Anyone in sales and commission only jobs, if they're not working, how are they going to be able to afford the rent that their residential rents, or mortgages? So people might be forced out of the city. With Broadway being closed, same thing. It's hundreds. It's 100,000 people. Actors and directors and tech people. Costume people. It's just that are out of work, and who knows when those Broadway theaters will reopen. So it's affecting everyone. It's affecting everyone differently. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people might not be able to afford to stay in the city. and they might not want to stay in the city even if they can afford it.
Right, right. So, I mean, I think that just to kind of, sum it up, I think that what you're saying is that we can, from the retail standpoint, we can expect that it sounds like a lot of inventory will be coming in the market. Certainly, some of the businesses are taking this opportunity to just exit, and they won't be, we see it every day on the, on the internet, on Facebook or wherever, about this business closed and closed permanently. And so we're going to see more inventory, and it sounds like it's a time when landlords are going to pursue different types of deals, either percentages, as you said, or they're going to have to adjust to a new normal, a reduced, definitely reduced rent to attract the businesses that are out there and that will want to open up. And maybe like the real estate market, the residential side, it's going to probably take at least a couple years, right, to deal with all this stuff.
Yeah, and then one last thing is, look, that was a lot more of the reality, and of the masses. 10,000 restaurants closing is what they're saying, but there's also a lot of restaurants and owners that have the money and have the capital that are going to actually take this time to expand. There's some coffee shops out there that, when the office market does come back, people still want their coffee. Like I said before, it's an affordable luxury. A cup of coffee is, or espresso drink is $4 or $5, but it's not, it's not hundreds of dollars, but people want to go out and buy that and get that. So there are some, there are some tenants out there that are going to take this time to expand. If they have the capital to do so, they're going to try to take advantage of the lower rents and try to set up a good business plan for the next 10 or 15 years, because they're going to take advantage of the lower rents. So there is definitely there's definitely deals that are going to happen. It just is for what amount and how long is going to be the big question.
And a lot of people over the last few years, before the last little dip, you saw the retail market, and you said also office kind of really ramp up to very high prices. And there was a period of time, where you'd see on just different sources, this business that's been around forever had to close, and that business and this club and that, live music place had to close because, there's a new, a Louis Vuitton or some boutique that's opening up that will be willing to pay a much higher rent. I mean, even I saw on West 72nd and Broadway, the Wells Fargo closed. They moved across the street to a smaller space.
Yep.
Because the rent was too high. So, if a bank is closing because the rents have gotten too high, I mean, that really tells you how much the rents ramped up. But maybe it'll be the chance for mom and pop to return.
Exactly. I mean, and 2 blocks south on 70th and Broadway, the Chase Bank closed.
Okay.
So yeah, like you said before, rents for banks, if there was a bank, they were charging astronomical rents for them. But now, I rarely go to a bank. Rarely. People deposit checks online, so they don't need as many locations that are out there. So yeah, the rents, if they can afford them, if they can afford a cheaper rent across the street, they'll do that. They'll take the capital improvement money, and if it's going to be cheaper over the long term, they'll move across the street, build out a new space, and carry on with their cheaper rent. And if what the landlord should do is they should take that, and a lot of landlords right now, they should take the tenants that they have and make deals with them to keep them in place, because there will be some tenants that are expanding, but if you have if you have a tenant in the space, reduce the rent, work with them, and keep them in that space, because if they go out, who knows how long it will take to keep them in.
Absolutely. And for people that want to get in touch with you, be it landlords or tenants who will be looking to open up spaces, what's the best way for them to get in contact?
Uh, email, which I don't know if I can give it to you now or if you can
Yeah,
post it.
I'll put a post, a link with it, the email that you want in this, and then as it goes out, different sources, YouTube and so on.
Perfect.
So, but email will be best, all
Yeah,
right?
email, my cell phone, anything. I'm always available. If they want, they can go to my company website, which is tscg.com,
Mhm.
for the shopping center group. Um, and yeah, they can find my contact information there. You can post it, cell phone, email. Come knock on my door if you want.
Okay. Well, so listen, Seth, thank you so much for joining me here on Facebook. I appreciate you taking the time on Memorial Day
Absolutely.
to, talk to us a little bit and give us a little bit of background as to what's going on in the retail market.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I'd love to do a follow up in a couple of weeks when we get some more answers, a few more questions answered.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be great. That would be great. Thanks. Thanks again, Seth.
Absolutely.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.